Camus, the Plague, Chapter 8, Part 2. Next day, Tarrou set to work and enrolled a first team of workers, soon to be followed by many others. However, it is not the narrator's intention to ascribe these sanitary groups more importance than their due. Doubtless today, many of our fellow citizens are apt to yield to the temptation of exaggerating the services they rendered. But the narrator is inclined to think that by attributing overimportance to praiseworthy actions, one may by implication be paying indirect but potent homage to the worst side of human nature. For this attitude implies that such actions shine out as rare exceptions, while callousness and apathy are the general rule. The narrator does not share that view. The evil that is in the world always comes of ignorance, and good intentions may do as much harm as malevolence if they lack understanding. On the whole, men are more good than bad. That, however, isn't the real point. But they are more or less ignorant, and it is this that we call vice or virtue. The most incorrigible vice being that of an ignorance which fancies it knows everything and therefore claims for itself the right to kill. The soul of the murderer is blind, and there can be no true goodness nor true love without the utmost clear-sightedness. Hence, the sanitary groups, whose creations were entirely Tarrou's work, should be considered with objectivity as well as with approval. And this is why the narrator declines to vaunt in overglowing terms a courage and a devotion to which he attributes only a relative and reasonable importance. But he will continue being the chronicler of the troubled, rebellious hearts of our townsfolk under the impact of the plague. Those who enrolled in the sanitary squads, as they were called, had indeed no such great merit in doing as they did, since they knew it was the only thing to do, and the unthinkable thing would then have been not to have brought themselves to do it. These groups enabled our townsfolk to come to grips with the disease, and convinced them that, now that the plague was amongst us, it was up to them to do whatever could be done to fight it. Since plague became in this way some men's duty, it revealed itself as what it really was, that is, the concern of all. So far, so good, but we do not congratulate a schoolmaster on teaching that 2 and 2 make 4, though we may perhaps congratulate him on having chosen his laudable vocation. Let us then say it was praiseworthy that Tarrou and so many others should have elected to prove that 2 and 2 make 4 rather than the contrary, but let us add that this goodwill of theirs was one that is shared by the schoolmaster and by all who have the same feelings as the schoolmaster, and be it said to the credit of mankind, are more numerous than one would think. Such anyhow is the narrator's conviction. Needless to say, he can see quite clearly a point that could be made against him, which is that these men were risking their lives. But again and again there comes a time in history when the man who dares to say that 2 and 2 make 4 is punished with death. The school teacher is well aware of this. And the question is not one of knowing what punishment or reward attends the making of this calculation. The question is that of knowing whether 2 and 2 do make 4. For those of our townfolk who risked their lives in this predicament, the issue was whether or not plague was in their midst, and whether or not they must fight against it. Many fledgling moralists in those days were going about our town proclaiming there was nothing to be done about it, and we should bow to the inevitable. And Tarrou, Ria, and their friends might give one answer or another, but its conclusion was always the same, their certitude that a fight must be put up in this way or that, and there must be no bowing down. The essential thing was to save the greatest possible number of persons from dying and being doomed to unending separation. And to do this, there was only one resource: to fight the plague. There was nothing admirable about this attitude, it was merely logical. Thus it was only natural that old Dr. Castell should plod away with unshaken confidence, never sparing himself at making anti-plague serum on the spot with the makeshift equipment at his disposal. Rieux shared his hope that a vaccine made with the cultures of the bacilli obtained locally would take effect more actively than serum coming from outside, since the local bacillus differed slightly from the normal plague bacillus as defined in textbooks of tropical diseases. And Castell expected to have his first supply ready within a surprisingly short period. That too is why it was natural that Grand, who had nothing of the hero about him, should now be acting as a sort of general secretary to the sanitary squads. A certain number of the groups organized by Theroux were working in the congested areas of the town with a view to improving the sanitary conditions there. Their duties were to see that houses were kept in a proper hygienic state, and to list attics and cellars that had not been disinfected by the local sanitary service. Other teams of volunteers accompanied the doctors on their house-to-house visits, saw to the evacuation of infected persons, and subsequently, owing to the shortage of drivers, even drove the vehicles conveying sick persons and dead bodies. All this involved the upkeep of registers and statistics, and Grand undertook the task. From this angle, the narrator holds that more than Rieux or Theroux, Grand was the true embodiment of the quiet courage that inspired the sanitary groups. He had said yes without a moment's hesitation, and with the large-heartedness that was a second nature with him. All he had asked was to be allotted light duties. He was too old for anything else. He could give his time from 6 to 8 every evening. When Rieux thanked him with some warmth, he seemed surprised. Well, that's not difficult. Plague is here and we've got to make a stand. That's obvious. I only wish everything were as simple. And he went back to his phrase. Sometimes in the evening, when he had filled his reports and worked out his statistics, Grand and Rieux would have a chat. Soon they formed the habit of including Theroux in their talks, and Grand unburdened himself with increasingly apparent pleasure to his two companions. They began to take a genuine interest in the laborious literary task to which he was applying himself while plague raged around him. Indeed, they too found in it a relaxation of the strain. "How's your young lady in horseback progressing?" Theroux would ask, and invariably Grand would answer with a wry smile, "Trotting along, trotting along." One evening, Grand announced that he had definitely discarded the adjective elegant for his horsewoman. From now on, it was replaced by slim. "That's more concrete," he explained. Soon after, he read out to his two friends the new version of the sentence. One fine morning in May, a slim young horsewoman might have been seen riding a handsome sorrel mare along the flowery avenues of the Bois de Boulogne. Don't you agree with me? One sees her better that way. And I've put one fine morning in May because in the month of May tended rather to drag out the trot, if you see what I mean. Next, he showed some anxiety about the adjective handsome. In his opinion, it didn't convey enough, and he set to looking for an epithet that would promptly and clearly photograph the superb animal he saw with his mind's eye. Plump wouldn't do, though concrete enough it sounded perhaps a little disparaging, also a shade vulgar. Beautifully groomed had tempted him for a moment, but it was too umbrous and made the rhythm limp somewhat. Then one evening he announced triumphantly that he had got it, a black sorrel mare. To his thinking, he explained, black conveyed a hint of elegance and opulence. It won't do, Rieux said. Why not? Because sorrel doesn't mean a breed of horse, it's a color. What color? Well, a color that anyhow isn't black. Grand seemed greatly troubled. Thank you, he said warmly. How fortunate you're here to help me. But you see how difficult it is. How about glossy? Theroux suggested. Grand gazed at him meditatively, then said, Yes, he exclaimed, that's good. And slowly his lips parted in a smile. Some days later he confessed that the word flowery was bothering him considerably. As the only towns he knew were Oran and Montemar, he sometimes asked his friends to tell him about the avenues of the Bois de Boulogne, what sort of flowers grew in them and how they were disposed. Actually, neither Rhea nor Taru had ever gathered the impression that those avenues were flowery. But Grant's conviction on the subject shook their confidence in their memories. He was amazed at their uncertainty. It's only artists who know how to use their eyes, was his conclusion. But one evening the doctor found him in a state of much excitement. For flowery, he had substituted flower strewn. He was rubbing his hands. At last one can see them, smell them. Hats off, gentlemen. Triumphantly he read out the sentence. One fine morning in May, a slim young horsewoman might have been seen riding a glossy sorrel mare along the flower-strewn avenue of the Bois de Boulogne. But spoken aloud, the numerous S sounds had a disagreeable effect, and Grant stumbled over them, lisping here and there. He sat down, crestfallen, then asked the doctor if he might go. Some hard thinking lay ahead of him. It was about this time, as was subsequently learnt, that he began to display signs of absent-mindedness in office. A serious view was taken of these lapses of attention, as the municipality was not only working at high pressure with a reduced staff, but was constantly having new duties thrust upon it. His department suffered, and his chief took him severely to task, pointing out that he was paid to do certain work and was failing to do it as it should have been done. I am told that you are acting as a voluntary helper in the sanitary groups. You do this out of office hours, so it's no concern of mine, but the best way of making yourself useful in a terrible time like this is to do your work well. Otherwise, all the rest is useless. He's right, Colonel said to Ria. Yes, he's right, the doctor agreed, but I can't steady my thoughts. It's the end of my phrases that's worrying me. I don't seem able to sort it out. The plethora of sibilants in the sentence still offended his ear, but he saw no way of amending them without using what were, to his mind, inferior synonyms. And that flower-strewn, which had rejoiced him when he first lit on it, now seemed unsatisfactory. How could one say flowers were strewn, when presumably they had been planted along the avenues, or else grew there naturally? On some evenings, indeed, he looked more tired than Ria. Indeed, this unavailing quest which never left his mind had worn him out. Nonetheless, he went on adding up the figures and compiling the statistics needed for the sanitary groups. Patiently every evening he brought his totals up to date, illustrated them with graphs, and racked his brains to present his data in the most exact, clearest form. Quite often he went to see Ria at one of the hospitals and asked to be given a table in an office or the dispensary. He would settle down at it with his papers exactly as he settled down at his desk in the municipal office, and wave each completed sheet to dry the ink in the warm air, noisome with disinfectants and the disease itself. At these times he made honest efforts not to think about his horsewoman and concentrate on what he had to do. Yes, if it is a fact that people like to have examples given them, men of the type they call being heroic, and if it is absolutely necessary that this narrative should include a hero, the narrator commends to his readers, with, to his thinking, perfect justice, this insignificant and obscure hero who had to his credit only a little goodness of heart and a seemingly absurd ideal. This will render to the truth its due, to the addition of 2 and 2 its sum of 4, and to heroism the secondary place which rightly falls to it, just after, never before, the noble claim of happiness. It will also give this chronicle its character, which is intended to be that of a narrative made with good feelings. That is to say, feelings which are neither demonstrably bad nor overcharged with emotion in the ugly manner of a stage play. Such at least was Dr. Ria's opinion when he read in newspapers or heard on the wireless the messages and encouragement the outer world transmitted to the plague-ridden populace. Besides the comforts sent by air or overland, compassionate or admiring comments were lavished on the henceforth isolated town by way of newspaper articles or broadcast talks, and invariably their epical or prize speech verbiage jarred on the doctor. Needless to say, he knew the sympathy was genuine enough, but it could be expressed only in the conventional language with which men try to express that which unites them with mankind in general. a vocabulary quite unsuited, for example, to Grand's small daily effort, and incapable of describing what Grand stood for under plague conditions. Sometimes at midnight, in the great silence of the sleep-bound town, the doctor turned on his wireless before going to bed for the few hours sleep he allowed himself. And from the ends of the earth, across thousands of miles of land and sea, kindly, well-meaning speakers tried to voice their fellow feeling, and indeed did so, but at the same time proved the utter incapacity of every man truly to share in the suffering which he cannot see. Oran, Oran. In vain the call rang over oceans. In vain Ria listened hopefully. Always the tide of eloquence began to flow, bringing home still more the unbridgeable gulf that lay between Grand and the speaker. Oran, we're with you, they called emotionally. But not, the doctor told himself, to love or to die together. And that's the only way. They're too remote. Chapter 9, Part 2. As it so happens, what has yet to be recorded before coming to the culmination, during the period when the plague was gathering all its forces to fling them at the town and lay it waste, is the long, heart-rendingly monotonous struggle put up by some obstinate people like Rambert to recover their lost happiness, and to balk the plague of that part of themselves which they were ready to defend to the last ditch, in the last ditch. This was their way of resisting the bondage closing in upon them, and while their resistance lacked the active virtues of the other, it had, to the narrator's thinking, its point, and moreover it bore witness, even in its futility and incoherence, to a salutary pride. Rambert fought to prevent the plague from besting him. Once assured that there was no way of getting out of the town by lawful methods, he decided, as he told Ria, to have recourse to others. He began by sounding cafe waiters. A waiter usually knows much of what's going on behind the scenes, but the first he spoke to knew only of the very heavy penalties imposed on such attempts at evasion. In one of the cafes he visited, he was actually taken for a stool pigeon and curtly sent about his business. It was not until he happened to meet Cotard at Ria's place that he made a little headway. On that day, he and Ria had been talking again about his unsuccessful efforts to interest the authorities in his case, and Cotard heard the tail end of the conversation. Some days later, Cotard met him in the street and greeted him with the hail fellow well-met manner that he now used on all occasions. "Hello, Rambert, still no luck?" "None whatever. It's no good counting on the red-tape merchants. They couldn't understand if they tried." "I know that, and I'm trying to find some other way, but it's damn difficult." "Yes," Cotard replied, "it certainly is. He, however, knew a way to go about it. And he explained to Rambert, who was much surprised to learn this, that for some time past he had been going the rounds of their cafes, had made a number of acquaintances, and had learnt of the existence of an organization handling this sort of business. The truth was that Cotard, who had been beginning to live above his means, was now involved in smuggling ventures concerned with rationed goods, selling contraband cigarettes and inferior spirits at steadily rising prices. He was on the way to building up a small fortune. "Are you quite sure of this?" Rambert asked. "Quite. I had a proposal of the sort made to me the other day." "But you didn't accept it?" "Oh, come, there's no need to be suspicious." Cotard's tone was genial. "I didn't accept it because personally I have no wish to leave. I have my reasons." After a short silence he added, "You don't ask me what my reasons are, I notice." "I take it," Rambert replied, "that they're none of my business." "That's so, in a way, of course, but from another angle, well, let's put it like this. I've been feeling much more at ease here since the plague settled in." Rambert made no comment. Then he asked, "And how does one approach the organization, as you call it?" "Ah," Cotard replied, "that's none too easy. Come with me." It was 4 in the afternoon. The town was warming up to boiling point under a sultry sky. Nobody was about. All shops were shuttered. Cotard and Rambert walked some distance without speaking. under the arcades. This was an hour of the day when the plague lay low, so to speak. The silence, the extinction of all color and movement might have been due as much to the fierce sunlight as to the epidemic, and there was no telling if the air was heavy with menace or merely with dust and heat. You had to look closely and take thought to realize the plague was here, for it betrayed its presence only by negative signs. Thus Cottard, who had affinities with it, drew Rambert's attention to the absence of the dogs, which in normal times would have been seen sprawling in the shadows of the doorways, panting, trying to find a non-existent patch of coolness. They went along the Boulevard des Pommiers, crossed the Place d'Armes, and then turned down towards the dockyard. On the left was a cafe painted green, with a wide awning of coarse yellow canvas projecting over the pavement. Cottard and Rambert wiped their brows on entering. There were some small iron tables also painted green and folding chairs. The room was empty, the air humming with flies. In a yellow cage on the bar counter, a parrot squatted on its perch, all its feathers drooping. Some old pictures of military scenes covered with grime and cobwebs adorned the walls. On the tables, including that at which Rambert was sitting, bird droppings were drying, and he was puzzled whence they came, until, after some wing flappings, a handsome cock came hopping out of his retreat in a dark corner. Just then the heat seemed to rise several degrees more. Cottard took off his coat and banged on the tabletop. A very small man, wearing a long blue apron that came nearly to his neck, emerged from a doorway at the back, shouted a greeting to Cottard, and vigorously kicking the cock out of his way, came up to the table. Raising his voice to drown the cock's indignant cacklings, he asked what the gentleman would like. Cottard ordered white wine and asked, "Where's Garcia?" The dwarf replied that he'd not shown up at the cafe for several days. "Think he'll come this evening?" "Well, I ain't in his secrets, but you know when he usually comes, don't you?" "Yes, really, it's nothing very urgent. I only want him to know this friend of mine." The barkeeper rubbed his moist hands on the front of his apron. "Ah, so this gentleman's in business too?" "Yes," Cottard said. The little man made a snuffling noise. "All right, come back this evening. I'll send the kid to warn him." After they had left, Rambert asked what the business in question might be. "Why, smuggling, of course. They get the stuff in past the sentries at the gates. There's plenty of money in it." "I see." Rambert paused for a moment, then asked, "And I take it they're friends in court?" "You've said it." In the evening the awning was rolled up, the parrot squawking in its cage, and the small tables were surrounded by men in their shirt sleeves. When Cottard entered, one man, with a white shirt gaping on a brick-red chest and a straw hat planted well back on his head, rose to his feet. He had a sun-tanned face, regular features, small black eyes, very white teeth, and 2 or 3 rings on his fingers. He looked about 30. "Chiro," he said to Cottard, ignoring Rambert, "let's have one at the bar." They drank 3 rounds in silence. "How about a stroll?" Garcia suggested. They walked towards the harbor. Garcia asked what he wanted to do. Cottard explained that it wasn't really for a deal that he wanted to introduce his friend, Monsieur Rambert, but only for what he called a getaway. Puffing at his cigarette, Garcia walked straight ahead. He asked some questions, always referring to Rambert as he, and appearing not to notice his presence. "Why does he want to go?" "His wife is in France." "Ah." After a short pause, he added, "What's his job?" "He's a journalist." "Is he now?" "Journalists have long tongues." "I told you, he's a friend of mine," Cottard replied. They walked on in silence until they were near the wharves, which were now railed off. Then they turned in the direction of a small tavern, from which came a smell of fried sardines. "In any case," Garcia said finally, it's not up my street. Raoul's your man, and I'll have to get in touch with him. It's none too easy." "That's so? Cotard sounded interested. He's lying low, is he? Garcia made no answer. At the door of the tavern he halted and for the first time addressed Rambert directly. The day after tomorrow, at 11, at the corner of the customs barracks in the upper town. He made as if to go, then seemed to have an afterthought. It's going to cost you something, you know. He made the observation in a quite casual tone. Rambert nodded, naturally. On the way back, the journalist thanked Cotard. Don't mention it, old chap. I'm only too glad to help you. And then, you're a journalist. I dare say you'll put in a word for me one day or another. 2 days later, Rambert and Cotard climbed the wide, shade-kissed streets leading up to the upper part of the town. Shadeless street leading up to the upper part of the town. The barracks occupied by the customs officers had been partly transformed into a hospital, and a number of people were standing outside the main entrance, some of them hoping to be allowed to visit a patient. A futile hope, since such visits were strictly prohibited, and others to glean some news of an invalid, news which in the course of an hour would have ceased to count. For these reasons there were always a number of people and a certain amount of movement at this spot, a fact which probably accounted for its choice by Garcia for his meeting with Rambert. It puzzles me, Cotard remarked, why you're so keen on going. Really, what's happening here is extremely interesting. Not to me, Rambert replied. Well, yes, one's running some risks, I grant you. All the same, when you come to think of it, one ran quite as much risk in the old days, crossing a busy street. Just then Rieu's car drew up level with them. Tarrou was at the wheel, and Rieu seemed half asleep. He roused himself to make the introductions. We know each other, Tarrou said. We're at the same hotel. He then offered to drive Rambert back to the center. No thanks, we've an appointment here. Rieu looked hard at Rambert. Yes, Rambert said. What's that? Cotard sounded surprised. The doctor knows about it? There's the magistrate. Tarrou gave Cotard a warning glance. Cotard's look changed. Monsieur Othon was striding down the street towards them, briskly yet with dignity. He took off his hat as he came level with them. Good morning, Monsieur Othon, said Tarrou. The magistrate returned the greeting of the men in the car, and turning to Rambert and Cotard, who were in the background, gave them a quiet nod. Tarrou introduced Cotard and the journalist. The magistrate gazed at the sky for a moment, sighed, and remarked that these were indeed sad times. I've been told, Monsieur Tarrou, he continued, that you are helping to enforce the prophylactic measures. I need hardly say how commendable that is. A fine example. Do you think, Dr. Rieu, that the epidemic will get worse? Rieu replied that one could only hope it wouldn't, and the magistrate replied that one must never lose hope. The ways of Providence were inscrutable. Tarrou asked if his work had increased as the result of the present conditions. Quite the contrary. Criminal cases of what we call first instance are growing rarer. In fact, almost my only work just now is holding inquiries into more serious breaches of the new regulations. Our ordinary laws have never been so well respected. That's because, by contrast, they necessarily appear good ones, Tarrou observed. The magistrate, who seemed unable to take his gaze off the sky, abruptly dropped his mildly meditative air and stared at Tarrou. What does that matter? It's not the law that counts, it's the sentence. And that is something we must all accept. That fellow, said Cotard when the magistrate was out of hearing, is enemy number one. Tarrou pressed the starter. Some minutes later, Rambert and Cotard saw Garcia approaching. Without making any sign of recognition, he came straight up to them and, by way of greeting, said, You'll have to wait a bit. There was complete silence in the crowd around them, most of whom were women. Nearly all were carrying parcels. They had the vain hope of somehow smuggling these into their sick kinsfolk, and the even crazier idea that the latter could eat the food they brought. The gate was guarded by armed sentries, and now and again an eerie cry resounded in the courtyard between the barrack rooms and the entrance. Whenever this happened, anxious eyes turned toward the sick wards. The three men were watching the scene when a brisk "Good morning" from behind made them swing round. In spite of the heat, Raoul was wearing a well-cut dark suit and a felt hat with rolled-up brim. He was tall and strongly built, his face rather pale. Hardly moving his lips, he said quickly and clearly, "Let's walk down to the center. You, Garcia, needn't come." Garcia lit a cigarette and remained there while they walked away. Placing himself between Robert and Cottard, Raoul set the pace a fast one. Garcia's explained the situation, he said. "We can fix it, but I must warn you it'll cost you a cool 10,000. Robert said he agreed to these terms. "Lunch with me tomorrow at the Spanish restaurant near the docks." Robert said, "Right," and Raoul shook his hand, smiling for the first time. After he had gone, Cottard said he wouldn't be able to come to luncheon the next day as he had an engagement, but anyhow, Robert didn't need him anymore. Then, when the next day Robert entered the Spanish restaurant, everyone turned and stared at him. The dark, cellar-like room below the level of the small yellow street was patronized only by men, mostly Spaniards, judging by their looks. Raoul was sitting at a table at the back of the room. Once he had beckoned to the journalist and Robert started to go towards him, the curiosity left the faces of the others and they bent over their plates again. Raoul had beside him a tall, thin, ill-shaven man with enormously wide shoulders, an equine face and thinning hair. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, displaying long, skinny arms covered with black hair. When Robert was introduced, he gave 3 slow nods. His own name, however, was not announced, and Raoul, when referring to him, always said, "Our friend. Our friend here thinks he may be able to help you. He is going—" Raoul broke off as the waitress had just come to take Robert's order. "He's going to put you in touch with 2 of our friends who will introduce you to some sentries whom we've squared. But that does not mean that you can start right away. You'll have to leave it to those sentries to decide on the best moment. The simplest thing will be for you to stay some nights with one of them. His home is quite near the gate. The first thing is for our friend here to give you the contacts needed. Then, when everything's set, you'll settle with him for the expenses." Again the friend slowly moved his equine head up and down without ceasing to munch the tomato and pimento salad he was shoveling into his mouth, after which he began to speak with a slight Spanish accent. He asked Robert to meet him the next day for 1 at 8 in the morning in the cathedral porch. "Another 2 days wait," Robert observed. "It ain't so easy as all that, you see," Raoul said. "Them boys take some finding." Horseface nodded slow approval once more. Some time was spent looking for a subject of conversation. The problem was solved easily enough when Robert discovered that Horseface was an ardent football player. He too had been very keen on association football. They discussed their French championship, the merits of professional English teams, and the technique of passing. By the end of the meal, Horseface was in high good humor, was calling Robert old boy, and trying to convince him that the most sporting place by far on the football field was that of center half. "You see, old boy, it's the center half that does the placing, and that's the whole art of the game, isn't it?" Robert was inclined to agree, though he personally had always played center forward. The discussion succeeded peacefully until a wireless was turned on, and after at first emitting a series of sentimental songs, broke into the announcement that there had been 137 plague deaths on the previous day. No one present betrayed the least emotion. Horseface merely shrugged and stood up. Raoul and Robert followed his example. As they were going out, the center half shook Robert's hand vigorously. "My name's Gonzalez," he said. To Robert the next 2 days seemed endless. He looked up Rieux and described to him the latest developments, then accompanied the doctor on one of his calls. He took leave of him on the doorstep of a house where a patient, suspected to have plague, was awaiting him. There was a sound of footsteps and voices in the hall. The family were being warned of the doctor's visit. "I hope Theroux will be up to time," Rieux murmured. He looked worn out. "Is the epidemic getting out of hand?" Robert asked. Rieux said it wasn't that. Indeed, the death graph was rising less steeply, only they lacked adequate means of coping with the disease. "We're short of equipment. In all the armies of the world, a shortage of equipment is usually compensated for by manpower. But we're short of manpower, too." Haven't doctors and trained assistants been sent from other towns? Yes, Ria said. 10 doctors and 100 helpers. That sounds a lot, no doubt, but it's barely enough to cope with the present state of affairs, and it will be quite inadequate if things get worse. Rambert, who had been listening to the sounds within the house, turned to Ria with a friendly smile. Yes, he said, you'd better make haste to win your battle. Then a shadow crossed his face. You know, he added in a low tone, it's not because of that I'm leaving. Ria replied that he knew it very well, but Rambert went on to say, I don't think I'm a coward. Not as a rule, anyhow, but I've had opportunities of putting it to the test. Only these are some thoughts I simply cannot endure. The doctor looked at him in the eyes. You'll see her again, he said. Maybe, but I just can't stomach the thought that it may last on, and all the times she'll be growing older. At 30, one's beginning to age, and one's got to squeeze all one can out of life. But I doubt if you can understand. Ria was replying that he thought he could when Taru came up, obviously much excited. I just asked Panalu to join us. Well, he thought it over, then said yes. That's good, the doctor said. I'm glad to know he's better than his sermon. Most people are like that, Taru replied. It's only a matter of giving them the chance. He smiled and winked at Ria. That's my job in life, giving people chances. Excuse me, Rambert said. I've got to be off. On Thursday, the day of the appointment, Rambert entered the cathedral porch at 5 minutes to 8. The air was still relatively cool. Small, fleecy clouds, which presently the sun would swallow at a gulp, were drifting across the sky. A faint smell of moisture rose from the lawns, parched though they were. Still masked by the earthward houses, the sun was warming up Joan of Arc's helmet only, and it made a solitary patch of brightness in the cathedral square. A clock struck 8. Rambert took some steps in the empty porch. From inside came a low sound of intoning voices, together with stale wafts of incense and dank air. Then the voices ceased. 10 small black forms came out of the building and hastened away towards the center of the town. Rambert grew impatient. Other black forms climbed the steps and entered the porch. He was about to light a cigarette when it struck him that smoking might be frowned on here. At 8:15, the organ began to play, very softly. Rambert entered. At first he thought he could see nothing in the dim light of the aisle. After a moment he made out the small black forms that had preceded him in the nave. They were all grouped in a corner in front of a makeshift altar on which stood the statue of Saint Roche, carved in haste by one of our local sculptors. Kneeling, they looked even smaller than before, blobs of clouded darkness hardly more opaque than the gray smoky haze in which they seemed to float. Above them, the organ was playing endless variations. When Rambert stepped out of the cathedral, he saw Gonzalez already going down the steps on his way back to the town. I thought you'd cleared off, old boy, he said to the journalist, considering how late it is. He proceeded to explain that he'd gone to meet his friends at the place agreed on, which was quite nearby, at 10 to 8, the time they'd fixed, and waited 20 minutes without seeing them. Something must have held them up. There's lots of snags, in our line of business. He suggested another meeting at the same time on the following day, beside the war memorial. Rambert sighed and pushed his hat back on his head. Don't take it so hard, Gonzalez laughed. Why, think of all the swerves and runs and passes you've got to make to score a goal. Quite so, Rambert agreed, but the game lasts only an hour and a half. The War Memorial at Oran stands at the one place where one has a glimpse of the sea, a sort of esplanade, following for a short distance the brow of the cliff overlooking the harbor. Next day, being again the first to arrive at the meeting place, Rambert whiled away the time reading the list of names of those who had died for their country. Some minutes later, 2 men strolled up, gave him a casual glance, then resting their elbows on the parapet of the esplanade, gazed down intently at the empty, lifeless harbor. Both wore short-sleeved jerseys and blue trousers and were of much the same height. The journalist moved away, and seated on a stone beach, studied their appearance at leisure. They were obviously youngsters, not more than 20. Just then he saw Gonzalez coming up. "Those are our friends," he said, after apologizing for being late. Then he led Rambert to the two youths, whom he introduced as Marcel and Louis. They looked so much alike that Rambert had no doubt they were brothers. Well, I'm going to stop there.